Hello, how are you? Today we're going to look at property crimes, and I want to look at this, and I'm not going to review that chapter on political crime and terrorism. I go right from violent crime to this next voice thread of property crime, because I think that still political crime and terrorism is fairly rare. I want to make sure that we cover certain important things, and certainly violent crime and property crime are very, very represented in total crime statistics. So, to talk about property crime, economic crimes are any kind of violations of law for some type of financial gain. And I mentioned this before in previous slides, but property crimes are instrumental crimes. There's some type of financial gain or profit or property that's gained from these types of crimes. So instrumental crimes and property crimes are very similar. Okay. We have a curious contradiction in the United States, which I've drawn on the slide here. It says, although society disapproves of these crimes, there's this contradiction that almost every U.S. citizen has engaged in these crimes in one form or another. Almost everyone you know has taken some object from work, maybe not very expensive, pens, papers, office supply, but they've done this. People regularly cheat on their taxes. They will not inform someone of a mistake on a bill if it's in their favor. So these are crimes that are pretty common. And even though we disapprove of them, a lot of people do them, and they're often not viewed as harmful, really hurting anyone, and punished fairly lightly, especially in comparison with violent crime. Okay, so one important thing you can note, we pay a lot of attention to violent crime in our society, when in fact the occurrences of property crime they far outnumber violent crime. So that's an interesting thing to consider, what we pay attention to versus the actual numbers and amounts of, and which would better indicate what a problem is in our society. But our media accounts frequently focus on violent crime first, even though it's occurring less. Your text, as I mentioned before, has different typologies related to these categories, and you can look at the occasional versus the professional criminal, and that's discussed after a brief history of theft, which I don't think you really need to know about. The occasional versus professional distinction can be useful. Occasional is really like it sounds, and the key characteristics I'll go through on one side of the slide here. People who steal occasionally or commit property crime occasionally usually are spontaneous, spur of the moment. They're usually not skilled at what they're doing, and they don't plan. Furthermore, these are people who are not usually part of a group or collective identity, so they don't have any real support from a group, and it's not a key component of their identity, so they don't take on a criminal identity doing this. Finally, as it would make sense, occasional criminals, this isn't really a source of income, a main source for them. Professional criminals, on the other hand, the exact opposite. Professional criminals do this in an ongoing way, and that helps them to develop skills, and they become better at it. This means that often they're able to plan in more careful ways. They also have more community support and learn from others. One of the big debates about prison is it a smart idea for people who commit crimes like property crimes to all be housed together to learn from each other? Because some people say prisons are graduate schools for criminals. So professional criminals, as I just said, can learn a lot from others and may even have periods of apprenticeships. They take on a criminal identity. For example, in your text, the idea of being a thief could be a point of honor for some, the title. It's also seen as a primary source of income for professional criminals. You might remember Edwin Sutherland from a previous voice thread. He did studies about professional criminals and they go back a ways. These are from like the 1930s, so perhaps, as I have here under the critique, the model may be outdated, but they're also historically noteworthy. And this is his kind of findings from that period. He talked about professional criminals as really just like anyone today, specialized and focused. If you want to have a good career these days, you have to learn particular knowledge and skill. And that's exactly what he found with criminals, even in the 30s. They engaged in a very limited type of crime and specialized. He also found that they typically are not violent or forceful in that they want to use their brains to get out of problems. So they might make a lot of use of their wits. They put up a front. They put on a believable demeanor to get out of problem situations, and their ability to talk their way again out of situations. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, for these professionals, the idea of being a thief might be seen as a prestigious title, particularly among other criminals. This is something that you trained in and you have a lot of special knowledge. It also is characterized by the idea of not being a snitch. You do not inform on other criminals because those networks are very important to you. Again, as I mentioned, the critique of this, some people argue the model may be outdated, but it can have use, and it's good to know about some of these cornerstones of research in criminology. The fence, I always think of a fence as something between one person and another, and the definition in criminology is this person who buys and sells stolen goods, a middle person. And again, the typology in your textbook of these, they differentiate professional fences versus non-professional. And this is not a blow-by-blow comparison I have on your slide, but they're points that I think characterize each one, and I'll walk through them with you. Professionals, it mentions in your textbook, are very familiar with the law and how it involves property and what counts as stolen or not. There's a particular name I'd like you to know, Carl Clockers, who studied a man he called Vincent Swaggy. And Vincent Swaggy was a professional fence. And basically, Clockers found that Swaggy had only spent 4 months in prison over a very long career. And the reason he only spent 4 months in prison was because he had a very keen knowledge of the laws related to stolen property. In order to be convicted of this, the prosecution has to prove that the accused was both in possession of the property and that they knew that that property had been stolen. And in his instance, they obviously couldn't prove it very often. Part of the reason why, if you've ever pawned an item, you have to sometimes make a statement that this is not stolen material is so that the pawn shop is not liable for selling it. If they have a signed statement that you say it's not stolen, then they have an okay case to say that they didn't know if it was. Okay. Also, too, being a professional fence requires that you have cash on hand, because you don't know what types of things are going to come your way and people might bring to have interest in selling to you. There's also an important idea where you have to know how to deal. In other words, you have to negotiate prices quickly. You might have to kind of have a rough idea of the value of different things. Now with the internet, this has become a lot easier. In the past, people had to just know what types of money they could get for what items. You have to be connected with both, of course, suppliers and with buyers, because you're trying to regularly market things and sell and then buy again to make money. Also, too, complying with the police, and I want to be careful about this, but complying with the police means knowing when to comply. For example, if maybe the mayor of Kearney was burglarized and had stuff stolen, the police might be very interested in finding that individual, and so may put some pressure on fences and the fence may feel compelled to give up that person because of that intense pressure, so they know what's in their interest regarding the police. It also says that professionals buy stolen goods at a price relative to the status of the thief. So for example, if the thief is addicted to something, they may only give a smaller percentage of what that item is normally sold to a fence for, because they know that's all that person will need to get their fix. Okay. Non-professionals have also specific characteristics. There's 4 types they mention. The part-timer is someone who has other sources of income. They only do this sporadically. The associational type is someone who has some type of legitimate connection with criminals. And the example they mention in the text might be, for example, a lawyer for someone who says, can I pay you with, say, for example, this Rolex watch, and that watch might have been stolen. So they're associational in that they receive this stolen item, but under the guise of some type of legitimate relationship with the criminal. The neighborhood hustler and the amateur receiver, I can tell you about examples from my own life. When I lived in Las Vegas, I was doing research on homeless people, and I would regularly take a bus. And on that bus, there would be a fellow. He'd get on with a plastic bag, and he'd start at the beginning of the bus, and he would walk down the aisle, and he would say, batteries $2, batteries $2, batteries $2. And of course, on a public bus at the time, people used Walkmans and various different items that were electronic that required batteries. He, I would characterize as a neighborhood hustler. I suspect that he had not come across those batteries in a legitimate way, and he was trying to sell them. So he was fencing these things as maybe just one way to make a quick buck. And that's something he did very successfully. He'd go right on the bus, walk down, sell his stuff, and then leave the bus and be gone. The people who would buy the batteries from him would be these amateur receivers. So these are strangers who would buy publicly from someone who they might strongly suspect has received those goods illegally. Larceny. This is a crime that was originally defined through the trespassory taking, or the going on to another person's property in order to take things, or intending to take things. So that's the common law definition. What's happened today is our society, we have property that sometimes we voluntarily put in the hands of someone else. So for example, if you go to Las Vegas and you give your car keys to a valet, no one, that valet hasn't trespassed on your property with the intent to steal. But if they take your car, then they are engaged in larceny. And the way that we've changed things to create what you could call a legal fiction is this notion I've underlined here, constructive possession. So what that means is, if you give your clothes to a dry cleaner, or your car to a valet, or your TV to a repair shop, you maintain constructive possession, even though you don't have actual physical possession. So it's a legal fiction, which indicates that you fully intend to get your property back and that they're legally obligated to give it back to you. So that has gotten around the old common law definition where you don't need to trespass on someone's property in order to be accused of or convicted, possibly, of larceny. We can differentiate petty or petite larceny versus grand. Petty, of course, means small, grand is large. Petty larceny may be a misdemeanor, grand larceny may be a felony. And there are different ways that you can think about how to classify something as petty versus grand. They're always based on the value of whatever goods have been stolen. And each state, as it says in the text, that each state sets its own boundaries for this. So in Virginia it says Um, if the volume of the item stolen is 200 or more, then it's grand larceny. Less is petty larceny. And it says there, grand larceny is punishable, by up to 20 years in prison, or up to 12 months in jail. That's an interesting difference. And then petty larceny in Virginia is a misdemeanor, which the maximum you would get is 12 months in jail. So each state's different. But there's a big issue with this, which is how do you determine the value of property? For example, if something is stolen, maybe it's a family heirloom, it's very valuable to you, but perhaps it doesn't have much value in a market economy. You couldn't sell it for much. There's also an issue of how much it costs to replace something. And so it might be very expensive to replace an item that's no longer on sale, for example. So these are questions that are dependent on the situations and something that is tricky. The value of property is socially determined. So something to consider with the difference. Shoplifting is a fascinating category of theft because in some ways it's completely unique. Only 10% of all shoplifters are professionals. It says that this shoplifting occurs maybe between 2 and 300 million instances each year, which is really amazing since the population of the United States is around 311 million people. So that could be as many as almost one incident per person in the United States. Yet, only 10% of the people are professionals. Here's the strange thing. Amateurs, though, still might well steal systematically and come prepared to steal. So amateurs might, for example, come with a long trench coat to put items inside of them. So curious contradictions, if you will. Another important characteristic of shoplifters is they'll usually reform if they're apprehended. And that has policy implications, because if you, for example, know that shoplifters will be reformed, you might want to put money into scared straight programs in order to educate shoplifters about the cost of their crime, but maybe not give them sentences in jails, which might not necessarily be necessary. It might be more expensive than the good that they do if those people would likely reform. Other curious aspects of shoplifting, customers are usually very unlikely to report it, even if they see it directly. There are a lot of potential strategies for preventing this crime, and to go through just a few of them. Dummy goods being on display can inhibit shoplifting. If I go into Walmart, for example, here, there may be electronics that are on display, but none of the electronics, the actual electronics, are inside them. It's just a case to show you kind of how large that product is and what it generally looks like. Second, you have sometimes the locking of goods or the electronic monitoring of goods. Sometimes you might go into an expensive leather store and they might have their coats on a chain with a large ring at the end of it to make sure you don't walk out with that item. Conversely, too, you might have beeping systems where an item sets off an alarm because it's got some kind of trigger inside of it. Kind of not unlike what we have at the UNK library, right? So you don't steal books. Also, too, I don't know why Walmart is on my mind, but inside of Walmart there used to be signs inside the restrooms which would say shoplifting is a crime, and here are the possible consequences of doing that. So warning signs can tell people not to do something, remind them not to do it in a private place where they might not be able to have surveillance cameras. Surveillance cameras are ubiquitous today. They're all over. In Las Vegas, they're called the eye in the sky, and you see them as these smoky colored domes that are attached to ceilings, so frequent, omnipresent all over the place, and are often very useful in trying to figure out who might be engaged in shoplifting. Your text mentions that auto theft is a serious crime these days. There are quite a number of auto thefts in the United States. It says about 1.2 million cars are stolen each year in the United States. And there are criminologists who have come up with different types. Each one somewhat unique. There might be some overlap between these categories. They may not, therefore, be fully mutually exclusive, but we'll talk about that. Joyriding is this idea of usually maybe teenagers basically just wanting to take a car for a ride. And they're not out to gain profit or anything like that, but just to have the experience of having a car for a very brief time. Short-term transportation can be a little bit different, perhaps, from joyriding, that sometimes it's just taking a car and going from one place to another, say, for example, in a town. Long-term transportation might be stealing a car in one place to keep it for personal use or to go for quite a long distance with that vehicle, another city or state, for example. Profit means that someone would steal a car in order for monetary gain. So this falls under the notion of chop shops, which you've probably heard of, places where the different parts of a car will be reassembled to make it difficult to track a stolen vehicle. That can involve falsifying identity numbers and registration papers. Finally, you can also talk about auto theft in order to commit another crime. A bank robber, for example, might want to steal a car so as to not be fully traceable, difficult to find. False pretense and fraud is another category. There's a discussion of here in your text. They mention that it's about some wrongdoer's misrepresentation of a fact, which causes a victim to willingly give up his or her property, and then that person, the wrongdoer, ends up keeping it. There are different kinds of false pretense and fraud. One that they mention, confidence games. The description is that they're run by swindlers whose goal is to separate the victim from his or her money. And some examples of those, they talk about telemarketing scams, where someone will call your house and try to get you to buy products, get your credit card number or other information, and then take that in order to make money. Also, too, things like direct mail marketing schemes, people who will use the mail in order to, again, try to defraud you. I'd like you to know the difference between fraud and embezzlement, because these are different. Fraud means that the person committing the crime never has had lawful possession of whatever it was that was taken. If you talk about embezzlement, the person did at one point have legal possession of the property, but they transferred it, converted it to themselves, which means that they stole it. So a key aspect to know about the difference between fraud and embezzlement is when criminal intent was formed. Okay? In fraud, you had criminal intent right from the beginning. In embezzlement, the criminal intent appears after this person who has a legitimate relationship with the property and with you decides to commit a crime. Let me briefly define burglary before we talk about Neil Shover's study of the characteristics of the good burglar. The common law definition is the breaking and entering of a dwelling house of another in the nighttime with the intent to commit a felony within. So this is curious because the common law definition stresses a particular time of day, for a burglary, and it's at night. And that is a little bit different than other ideas of theft. Why is it that nighttime is pointed out? Probably because that's a time when people are at home and sleeping, and if someone is wanting to steal at that period, it has a increased potential for violence. And so that is why burglary is considered its own unique form of crime. Neil Shover is the name of the fellow who did this study of the good burglar and the characteristics of a good burglar. And there were several that Shover found. Just like the other types of specialized crimes, people will specialize in burglary. And so good burglars, people considered good at this, have technical competence that they have trained over a period of time. And again, they may have worked as an apprentice under a more skilled burglar to learn the trade, if you will. They also are interested in maintaining personal integrity. So they, again, like other professional criminals, they do not snitch on their fellow criminals, their fellow burglars. I mentioned this idea of specialization. So this means that they might be very familiar, for example, with house alarm systems. They are very keen on understanding patterns of behavior when people might not be home or when they are home, how to avoid detection. So they've honed their skills in this area. Another characteristic, they also make money at their crimes. So they're good at it, and that leads them to specialize and have a career in this. Finally, they're also able to avoid prison sentences. So it says that in some instances they know, again, how to find fences. They don't have to risk working with unknown people, and they know how to choose targets that are going to work in their favor. Finally, in this chapter, discussion of arson. And arson, it says, 70,000 of these are now recorded each year. Some of them cause a lot of death, and they, of course, will lead to property damage. So there are reasons that people focus on this, and again, another typology that's been developed regarding this crime. They have three types that they mention, and these are a little bit tricky, so let me walk through them with you briefly. Arson for profit. Okay, that's the idea of someone who wants to make money by being paid to do this crime. So they are trying to get someone to pay for them to commit an arson. That's different from arson for fraud. The idea of arson for fraud is when, like, a business owner owns a business and then pays someone else, perhaps, to burn their place down in order to collect, for example, insurance money. Okay, so arson for fraud might be a business owner. In my case, my hometown of Fairbanks, Alaska, one guy, he had a Dairy Queen that wasn't making money, so he set the gas stove to be on, and then knowing full well that the refrigerator would set off a spark when it came on and the place would explode. So he was trying to collect insurance money. That's a perfect example of arson for fraud. Finally, there's a discussion about a juvenile arsonist, and they mention 4 types, which I don't have listed, but I'll talk to you about, and you can note that way. The playing with matches fire setter. Playing with matches fire setter is between the ages of 4 and 9 years old, and usually just confine matches because parents are careless, for example. The crying for help fire setter, they put between the ages of 7 and 13, and they're setting fires, believe it or not, to reduce stress. So they may have difficulty expressing their feelings like sorrow or anger. The delinquent fire setter is the 3rd type, And these are youths who might set fires at schools or areas to respond to some slight that they've experienced there. Finally, the severely disturbed fire setter. This is, again, a younger person who might actually have dreams about fire in vivid color, and they might obsess about fire, and they're seen as very disturbed. So this typology, again, might give you an indication of what types of reasons there are for doing these crimes, the motivations, and that should give you insights into how you should allocate resources in order to address those crimes.